Joining us now for analysis is Scott Braddock, editor of the Quorum report, covering all things Texas politics. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
So, Senator Eckhart raised some concerns about the powers that the lieutenant governor is going to have during this trial, presiding over it. Is any of that unusual, this level of control he has, at least in this context?
The lieutenant governor has spent about 20 years working to consolidate power in his office and in himself in particular, and I didn't see why that was going to change for an impeachment trial. He's been working on the Senate rules since he first ran for the Senate, going back to 2006, to change the threshold for what it takes for a bill to come to the floor. Really ends up consolidating power in the lieutenant governor's office. So I'm not surprised about it, but we only have two examples in the past on record for impeachments. One was of a judge in South Texas, the other was of a governor back in 1917. And so there's not a whole lot of precedent to pull out those old documents and dust those off and figure out how to do this. They're kind of flying blind on a lot of this, and I don't think that when the framers of the Texas Constitution sat down and wrote that foundational document, they ever could have anticipated you'd have an alleged crime family living in the Attorney General's office and working in one of the state Senate offices, but that's what we have now. That's the allegation, right? And so they had to really thread the needle carefully when they were writing these rules.
Yeah, that may be why this was not a smooth process at all, getting these rules done. The original committee had 3 weeks to work on it, I believe, and then once they were presented to all the senators, it took almost 2 full days to hammer out the details. We saw them recess and come back and recess and come back. But they've been very tight-lipped about what they were discussing behind closed doors. Do you have any sense on what the holdups or the disagreements on these rules were?
There was not a lot of chatter out of those closed-door meetings. The senators, I can tell you, are taking it very seriously, that they're not supposed to comment either publicly or privately about what's going on in these proceedings. They're taking their job as jurors seriously. I do believe, in just observing the process, that the major sticking point had to be, what will the role of Paxton's wife, who is a state senator, what will her role be? And again, they had to thread this needle carefully because the Constitution says that the Senate can come up with its rules and maybe create a situation for recusals, but it also says that all senators need to sit for the trial. Now, I do believe that there's a mechanism by which they could have completely excluded Angela Paxton, but they chose not to do that. They left it such that she can be present, but it's important to note she can't vote on the outcome at the end of the trial, and she can't be in the closed-door deliberations of the Senate, and both of you have covered the Senate, you know this. The meeting in the Senate that's the most important is the one they always have behind closed doors before they come out on the floor and do whatever they're going to do. And so if Angela Paxton was planning, let's just say this is her plan, if she was planning to be in that room to advocate for her husband, she won't be. I would say that if you held the vote today, there's probably a majority of senators who would vote to convict, but not a supermajority. My head counts around 17 senators.
Wow. And we have to wonder if that was maybe perhaps a compromise of letting her be somewhat, on the court of impeachment, but not having a say, although the threshold is still the same of 21 votes needed. Right. That said, was there anything else in those rules, going through all those pages, as I know you have been, that surprised you or stood out to you?
Very interesting that the allegations that have to do with securities fraud, those are not going to be dealt with by the Senate at first. When you look at the rules, they set those aside, and they're going to look at all the other things that have to do with Paxton having a mistress and trying to get a job for her with this quote-unquote shady developer in Austin.
Do you think that's because of the federal indictment?
It may be, and we'll see. You do have the criminal proceeding that's supposed to play out at the state court charges that are going to be dealt with in Houston. That decision was just made recently. Ken Paxton lost in a motion on that. He was trying to have the criminal trial in his home county of Collin County up in North Texas, but it's going to be in Houston instead, so that's going to play out at some point. I don't think it's going to play out before this impeachment trial starts in September. A lot of moving parts to this and so many problems for him, and you have to think that if witnesses start taking the stand in the Senate and evidence starts to be presented in the Senate, that it's at least going to have some ripple effect for what happens in that criminal case.
Yeah. From the other parties, we've heard almost unanimous praise of these rules from both counsels, from the prosecutors and the defense. From the House impeachment managers, they said that this lays out a fair trial. Is that the general sense, or are there any other concerns that you're hearing about these rules.
Well, there were only 3 no votes. I mean, it's important to point out. So the Senate is essentially on the same page. There's always, I mean, when they debate the most important work product of the legislature, the budget, there's often maybe 1 or 2 no votes. There's always some dissent. But I think for Republicans and Democrats, and for the folks who are on both sides of this, Paxton supporters and those who want to see him removed, they got probably the best deal that they could have gotten. I think a lot of this was a compromise, and that's why it did take so long behind closed doors to come up with these rules.
All right, Scott Braddock of the Quorum Report, thanks for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.